Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining our first BBVA Carbon Talk. The idea is to create a forum where we discuss relevant topics for the carbon markets, for sustainable finance, and the low carbon transition. We want to add value with this discussion, provide background and context that matters on topics that matter to you and impact your business. And our first edition is on the European Emissions Trading System. As you might know, the European Emissions Trading System was established in 2005 and is by far the biggest carbon market in the world. Last year, the turnover was around 750 billion euros. And with that, the EU ETS acts as a benchmark to other carbon pricing systems globally, and of course, as well on the voluntary carbon market. So I'm very glad that we can have this discussion today to discuss what's next in the European Emissions Trading System. But before we start, some housekeeping. The discussion is around 60 minutes. It's being recorded and accessible on demand. In case you have any questions that you would like to ask during the panel, please use the chat function, and we will then try to include your questions in the discussion. The other point is that this discussion is close to the press. It's a private video conference and is not open to the media. In general, it's under Chatham House rules, and therefore, please do not quote any comments here and put a reference to the person who spoke about that. Let me introduce the panel. We have Jos Delbeke. Jos Delbeke is professor at the EUI in Florence, holding the first EIB chair on climate policy and international carbon markets. Before, he was Director General of the European Commission, and Jos joined the European Commission already in 1986. He has been deeply involved in the EU's climate policy and dubbed the architect of the European Emissions Trading System, or sometimes as well the father of the EU ETS. We have Ingvild Sohus. She is the head of the EU carbon analysts at WAIT. She is working in this field for many, many years. I think she started around 2007 and worked, among others, for Refinitiv and Point Carbon. And then we have Jan Andreasen. Jan Andreasen is lead analyst, EU carbon and power markets at energy analytics provider ICIS, where he manages the EU carbon markets team. Jan has been working in this field for over a decade, and he actually started his career as CDM project originator at Noble Group. My name is Ingo Ramming, and I'm heading the carbon team here at BBVA. Yes, with that, I would like to start with Jos Delbeke. And the aim of this discussion is to provide context for further discussions. Jos, the EU ETS is turning 18 years. A couple of weeks ago, the Fit for 55 package entered into force. And it will align the EU's cap with our Paris target, with the net zero by 2050. And besides stricter targets, it will add as well additional sectors. On top, the CBAM will bring an international dimension to the EU ETS. How do you see the developments? And are you a proud father?
Well, good afternoon to all. Yes, well, I'm rather pleased with the way the ETS is working. It has been, and it is planned to be, the major driver of the emission reductions for the quite ambitious targets that Europe has been adopting. And I'm also relatively pleased with the way the market stood well through the crisis of COVID and the war in Ukraine and the crisis on energy markets. So a lot of work lately, when I was still at the Commission, was on the Market Stability Reserve, and I think that has functioned relatively well. I think also that the price level we currently have is creating a fundamental incentive for low carbon innovations. And I think that's very important. It's a structuring element of many decisions made in the power sector and in the manufacturing industry. And now we have a CBAM, which is a very clear protection against carbon leakage. So that cluster is a fairly important development compared to where we started, as you indicated, 18 years ago. But the system is quite mature. I think we have a good price, we have good emission reductions, and we have a good compliance. Sometimes we do not put the emphasis on that, but the compliance provisions work relatively well. I think, yes, I'm rather pleased with the way it is going. And I, of course, hold my fingers crossed that this is going to continue in the future.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the price. If I remember, between 2013, before the MSR was introduced, 2017, 2018, I mean, there was always a discussion about we need a big fat of price of carbon because carbon was trading around 5-6 euros and therefore, of course, not creating any incentives. You mentioned the MSR. That was, from my perspective, possibly the most important introduction in the EU ETS, because otherwise there might have been the risk of many national policies. And with that, we have the prices, and we now trade at 90 to 100 euros. But I think what we saw as well during 2021, on back of the tighter or proposal of tighter targets, and then, of course, the jump in energy prices of gas prices, and then carbon trading close to 100, there was, of course, a little bit of, let's say, backlash, or some policymakers provided their concerns. And you could possibly argue the focus shifted to social costs and, of course, industrial competitiveness. And then discussion about speculation. But I think this is still around there, this concern. And how do you see this development? And especially if you would have, again, this kind of significant price jumps, do you see the risk of intervention from politicians, from policymakers in this scenario?
Well, before I turn to that, I think a fundamental change that has happened is that when the system was created, we looked at the price primarily. But now the price is fairly high, and so the revenues matter as much as the prices. And so the way revenues are used, for example, in terms of dampening the social impact, or in dealing with the industrial competitiveness of our companies, is, I think, very important. But indeed, as you are mentioning, liquidity needs to be in the market. And there was a kind of fear that there was a kind of speculation happening. And in the middle of the negotiations, the ESMA, the financial authorities of the European Union, were asked to come with a report on whether there was illegal speculation in the market, as it was called. And, they reassured everybody that this was not happening. But of course, ESMA is going to monitor the situation in the future. But still, the liquidity problem may be there because we have some front loading of allowances. We have the market stability reserve. We have the rebasing that happened. So the liquidity in the market has gone through a shock, and we will see that when phase 4 is being introduced. And what I pick up of discussions that I'm having now, more in the university context than I was at the European Commission at the time, is that we may need for the future a carbon bank. A carbon bank that would manage the liquidity, taking into account lots of considerations. I think that people start to realize, in particular in manufacturing industry, that by 2039, the issuance of allowances is going to come to a halt. These are very important dates. This is around the corner, because once we have reached 2030, 2039 is very nearby. And so I think there may be a need for a carbon bank because the targets are tough. The reduction percentage is tough, the rebasing is tough, and the front loading, is an indication, of where more interventions may be needed. So the idea of a carbon bank, I think we should reconsider that. I have to say, personally, I was never an enthusiast supporter of a carbon bank when I was at the Commission. But today, with prices hovering around 100 euros and expected to go through the 100 euros in the coming years, I think it would be good that we have a kind of authority looking at whether liquidity is there, whether speculation is happening, and whether interventions may be needed. That all points to something that needs to be well thought through, well prepared. We are not speaking of something that's may be necessary in the first 1 to 2 years, but in the medium-term perspective, I think it is worthwhile to look at that concept of a carbon bank that would look at liquidity with full attention.
Yeah, I assume this discussion about a carbon bank was around 2015, 16, and then you and the Commission, of course, preferred, let's call it an autopilot, like the MSR, where there is no political kind of intervention, but a pure kind of rule-based intervention on that side. You mentioned the fact, and I'm sure Ingvild will touch on that later, that towards 2038, 39, 40, we'll basically reach zero in the EU ETS cap. And in this context, but sometimes as well with regards to, let's call it a safety valve for prices, some argue that offsets should play a role. Removals should play a role in this context. If that's now European, or well, you were in the Commission when there was the CDM and JI. So what's your perspective on that? I mean, do you see the possibility that removals could play again a role in the European emissions trading system, and maybe a general perspective on the voluntary carbon market?
Well, I would not exclude that, but I would think that the Commission, if that moment would come, would do it completely different compared to how it was under the CDM. Under the CDM, we had a very open arrangement. CERs that were approved by the United Nations were accepted without any further controls. And there was hardly a quantitative limit. There was a general quantitative limit. So it was a fairly open door policy. And at the time, we were strong believers in the multilateral fabric and in the United Nations. Now, I have to say that I myself went several times to the UNFCCC Secretariat when we saw the flaws under the CDM to address the flaws. And I was very clear that if this, the UNFCCC would not address the flaws, that Europe would act unilaterally. And that is, in the end, what happened. Europe was shutting the door for the CERs, the CDM credits, which was quite of a radical decision, I do admit that. And how radical it was, it's also radical to reopen the door again. So that's the price you pay for this. But the credibility of those offsets, that is what's going to matter. I think there is no way that the EU can consider today the credits from the voluntary carbon market as they are currently exchanged. There is no solid governance of that. The earliest candidates I can see coming is on the removals, because there the EU has started a decent process of certification of carbon removals. That will take its time. It's a difficult issue, etc. But if we were to come to a good conclusion on the certification of removals, then I should not exclude that a debate is going to come, because rewards for removals is going to be asked for. And as I was saying, the carbon market has a price element, but also a revenue element. So that revenue may be important to encourage removals further. So I would plead in the medium to long term to reopening the market, but in a very cautious way, cautious in terms of restrictions on quantities, batches that are being opened, but also restrictions in terms of quality. Only decent and good credits can be considered to enter the market. And that's different from where it was under the CERs. You know, there were some very questionable CERs, which didn't cost almost anything, and they were earning a price on the European market of 30 euros. So, I had difficulties to explain that in the European Parliament, when people say, are you mad, to open the door that widely. So to cut a long story short, I would plead to reopen the door, but in a well-considered manner. And that is where the carbon bank as a concept could come in.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Coming back to the EU ETS, and we have, of course, not only participants from Europe, but as well from Turkey and other parts of the world. And there, the discussion about the CBAM obviously is an important point that's being discussed. I think for Europe is key for, let's say, creating a level playing field, especially if industry or if free allocation to industry is being phased out. We have this international component around that. What is your perspective on the CBAM in general? And let us focus first on the, let's call it the diplomatic kind of process, because you were part of the commission, or you were the Director General of the DG Climate when the discussion about international aviation was there, where international flights should be included in the EU ETS, and then later there was a compromise that only European flights were included. So what's your take? I mean, is there a risk of a déjà vu, or did we learn from that and will have a much better diplomatic approach on that side? And maybe CBAM could create a catalyst for global carbon pricing.
I think you are right. It may well turn out to be a catalyst, and I think that the international community is looking now different at this carbon price that would be enforced internationally. Times have changed. At the time of the international aviation, we talk 10, 15 years ago. Today we have the Paris Agreement. Everybody has obligations, etc. So I would not think that the same cold reaction is going to be there vis-a-vis CBAM compared to what it was under the international aviation. But still, a lot of diplomacy is necessary. And I see that the Commission is gearing up for that, for organizing that diplomacy, because, some states may prefer to go for their own carbon pricing and prove to the Commission that they are having already a carbon price on their products, and hence there is no need for another carbon price. But they will have to prove that. And that reduced liability that is is enshrined into the legislation, I think is a major invitation for other countries to go into carbon pricing. Now, the question is still there, whether the situation for our industry is going to be sorted out only through the CBAM. We have another wake-up call, which is the US IRA, which takes another line. In terms of pricing carbon, they subsidize carbon. And I think that what we learned and what we are currently learning is that for the low carbon industry to develop and to flourish in Europe, we need more than only a carbon price. We need also public support, like the IRA is doing, in order to kickstart and to give speed and scale to those low carbon investments. So there is a much wider debate on green industrial policy coming in Europe, and it is a welcome debate. And if some of our free allowances and some of the ETS revenues would be used in that perspective, that would be very useful, I think. So on CBAM, yes, lots of diplomacy is already starting, with unfriendly words, but still that's the way negotiations start with India, with China, with others. But many other emerging economies, mid-sized emerging economies, African countries, North African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries are already approaching many of the European players to find a way to live up to CBAM without them losing revenue. And I think that's a good sign.
Well, that would be the, let's say, the positive outcome on that side. And I think you wrote recently a paper on how CBAM can become a stepping stone towards carbon pricing globally. So to close our discussion, and we will see you, of course, then in the Q&A again, but to close it, what makes you hope we get a global carbon price, or at least a linking of different systems in the next 10 years?
Well, I think there is some hope, and we have already, a good debate. We have a Florence process that is coming together every year in Florence with China, with Canada, with New Zealand, with Korea, with California, Switzerland, UK. So we have, a very decent and good debate there. But the paper I was writing, together with my colleague Peter Vis, made a point that there is the possibility of a reduced CBAM liability, provided countries or companies can show they already paid a carbon price. But the legislation is not terribly clear. It is modeled as if those countries need to have an EU ETS type of carbon pricing system. And that's not the reality today. The countries that I was mentioning, China, New Zealand, Canada, etc., have indeed explicit carbon pricing systems that would accommodate this demand, but they are very different in design. So I think there is some homework to be done by the Commission to spell out which kind of carbon pricing systems would qualify for such a reduced CBAM liability and which ones are not. And we were dealing with the voluntary carbon market, whether they would qualify. I think they would have difficulties to qualify because the prices paid there are so low and so different compared to the prices paid in Europe. But there are systems, when I look at the Canadian system, when I look at the New Zealand system, how different they are, they could qualify. But it is not well spelled out in detail in the CBAM legislation. So I would hope that the diplomatic efforts that are now being developed are going to lead the Commission to specify better which kind of carbon pricing systems would qualify. And of course, what is happening under the Article 6 negotiations, the 6.2, 6.4, could be a very important opportunity to give them a boost, also for Europe to be a little bit more engaging in those discussions, to make them meaningful. Because if, for example, Article 6.4 was to fall into the same trap like the CDM, in the past, that would be a lost opportunity. So if we all go for Article 6 and for a C.4 kind of new multinational or UN endorsed instrument, let's make sure that this Article 6.4 mechanism is solid and is subject to good governance. That would prevent many of the problems we saw, at least in Europe, with the CDM in the past. And Europe was the main buyer of CDM credits in the past. So I think Europe has something to contribute and could share some useful lessons there. Also, in the field of CORSIA, there is a lot to be improved. It's a moving target. So far, CORSIA is not very, a very operational carbon pricing system, but it's there and it is open for improvement. So over time, it would be useful if CBAM could encourage those systems also to become much more credible in terms of the environmental and climate integrity that the world needs, according to the targets that were adopted under the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jos, for your time, and we'll see you later in the Q&A. It was great to get this, let's say, overview, the macro, the political frame for that. And now, of course, it's great to have Ingvild in the panel, and she will now put or translate the climate targets of the EU ETS into market impact. Thank you very much, Ingvild.
Thank you, and thank you, Jos and Ingo, for a very interesting discussion. So I will kind of touch a bit more on the climate target. What does that mean for the impact they have on the market? So next slide, please. Of course, higher ambitions means a higher or less room for emissions in the EU ETS. It was mentioned earlier that the EU ETS is one of the key instruments for Europe to reach its target. And of course, when we have a more ambitious 2030 target, that translates directly into a lower cap in the EU ETS. So the brown bar now shows kind of under the current legislation, that is kind of in place to reach the 2030 target, how the cap develops up until 2030, but also beyond 2030. And we see that for the current sectors, and so industry and power and aviation and shipping that will be included, will reach a target of 0 in 2040. So within the cap, it's no kind of room for emissions beyond 2040. Just to set it in perspective, of course, you can see like from the current or kind of from the previous legislation when we had the 40% 2030 target, it's kind of a massive kind of or it's reduced quite a lot, the cap. Just for comparison, the cap today, how much allowances are kind of allowed under the system is then reduced just for like the next 7 years, it will be reduced 43%. So it's quite kind of a massive task. We see that emissions need to decrease quite rapidly. Just wanted to mention that there is still kind of oversupply in the system. It's the last official oversupply number that came from the Commission in May is still kind of 1.1 gigatons. So it's one thing is kind of the cap and how much comes to the market via auctions of free allocations per year, but it's still oversupply in the market. For the market stability reserve, which has, I agree, was kind of, I would say, kind of defining before and after moment for the ETS, has soaked up quite a lot of the surplus allowances that had been hanging over the ETS as a dark cloud. Now we have the first kind of invalidation of allowances, and now and going forward, it will only kind of maximal have 400 million tons available in the market stability reserve that will be injected to the market once we are getting into a more shorter system. Next slide, please. So of course, I mean, we have talked about kind of history of the ETS and the price development, but this is just showing that, I mean, first of, we have had low prices. That has been a problem for many years. But of course, now we have carbon prices at a completely different level. And that is also, I would say, first and foremost, a response to higher climate ambition. I mean, already in 2019, end of 2019, when Ursula von der Leyen came and say Europe will be the first climate neutral continent, and to reach that we need to adjust our 2030 target if we're serious about the 2050 target. And then, of course, we later came that it was going to be at least 55% below 1990 levels. And then later, we also kind of was specified more that the ETS will need to take a bigger share of the burden to reach that target. So, of course, there is kind of a myriad of factors why we see prices at the levels they are today. Also, kind of, we don't have to forget the energy complex, but the underlying and the fundamental support is the higher climate ambition and kind of the new confidence or renewed confidence that the EU ETS is kind of the tool that sets the price to get where we need to be in Europe. Next slide, please. But of course, it's not that we all have perfect foresight. I mean, when we look at the prospect and the horizon, I mean, if everyone was having a perfect foresight, then we all know that, okay, we need a high carbon price. But there is kind of elements that is changing the market balance from year to year. Of course, kind of you have the emission side of things, and then you have also the supply side of things. When we had the Russian invasion in Ukraine, of course, it was one of Europe's response was to start this Repower EU plan to wean off Europe to be less dependent on the Russian fossil fuel. And of course, that requires quite a lot of funding, and part of that funding will be come from sale of EUAs. But the thing is that we only know kind of how much, like the amount of money that the sale of the EUA will bring to the table. But then on the other hand, we don't know kind of what, so we know the value, but we don't know exact volumes that will need to be sold. Of course, that will be dependent on price. If price is high, then you need to sell less to accumulate the same amount of money. So of course, this is a big kind of uncertainty now over the next few years. We know that now 16.5 million tons will be auctioned this year, but then for next year, 2024, 2025, and 2026, we don't know how much additional volumes that will be brought to the market to reach this 20 billion target. So of course, per year and splitting up year by year, it will be quite different, and that will also kind of change the market dynamics over the next few years. Next slide, please. Here I'm just like summing up kind of the key elements to look out for the next 5 years. This year we see the emissions for the sectors covered in the ETS, especially when we see kind of power sector emissions. They're kind of, we're going up slightly last year because we had a bit more kind of coal burn and lignite and less of the gas due to the extreme prices and no gas coming from Russia. But this year we see quite a big drop in emissions, also kind of due to less coal and lignite, but also due to kind of quite kind of steep decline in demand or power sector demand. So we're looking at a year where emission side is going quite much lower. At the same time, kind of for the second half of the year, we will see a bit more volume being injected to the market. Repower EU sales will start. Also, since the oversupply is shrinking, that the market stability reserve will soak up less, and so the daily auctions will be larger from September onwards. So this year, like isolated, is quite kind of on the bearish side, but then in 2024 we will see the first kind of then we'll see the start of the Fit for 55 legislation. So that is when it's implemented. We will have the first 2-off rebasing next year. The linear reduction factor, so how much the cap is reduced year by year, will increase. So almost doubling from what we have seen kind of now at the start of phase 4, 2021, 2022, and 2023. And then we'll kind of see this yearly reduction will be quite steep going forward. And of course, that is to tilt the cap, so we'll reach the 2030 target. Next year, as I showed in my previous slide, we have quite a lot of additional EUAs that will hit the market. So that's kind of a bit balancing off the maybe a bit of the bullish effect that we see from the Fit for 55 legislation start. For 2025, it's the same. We see quite a lot of EUAs that will be sold for Repower EU. And also that market stability reserve, since it's working with a bit of a lag, that we see the market stability reserve being less active, so closer to be defined as a balanced market. Then in 2026, then we're getting kind of more into the quite interesting dynamics as well, because in 2026 we'll have the second TO3 basing. We will see a bit for Repower EU or EUAs that will be sold for Repower EU, but that's kind of the last batch up until August. But then the market stability reserve will then kind of look at these volumes that was injected to the market in 24-25 and start to react to this, what it sees as higher supply. So we see kind of a bit kind of more active market stability reserve in these years where it's actually getting tighter. 2027, then of course you will also feel the effect that the Repower volumes have been front-loaded allowances. So now, if it hadn't been for the Repower EU, then we'll have kind of seen higher auction volumes in 2027. So now you kind of for 2027 and then kind of then until 2030, we'll kind of see the effect that some of these volumes are now front-loaded, and then you will have less volumes in these years. So even though kind of we're going to 2040, it's quite a lot of dynamics to look out for, both on the supply side and of course the supply side and the demand side in the next few years to come as well. Thanks. That was it for me.
You're muted, Ingo.
One day I will learn it. Thank you very much for that. And I was just saying to myself that it will not become boring in the European emissions trading system with all this kind of data coming up. We discussed in the first part about competitiveness and the impact of high prices on that side. And the next discussion will be with Jan about the current industrial production dynamics and the role of industrial decarbonization in the European emissions trading system. And with that, I would pass on to Jan. Thank you very much for joining.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ingo. And hold on, let me just see if we can see the slide. I had some issues a little bit earlier on the slide side. Can you see the first one, Ingo? Or yes, perfect.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Well, first of all, good afternoon to the group here in the discussion, and obviously to the audience wherever you are listening from. And a big thank you, obviously, to BBVA and Ingo for the kind invitation. So today my presentation will be focusing on the European industry in the EU ETS. There are two parts to my presentation. The first part will be on current industry dynamics, and the second part will be on the more the long-term decarbonization of the European industry towards 2030. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So if we look back at 2022, it was a fairly costly year for the European industry. Two key factors there, very tight gas market fundamentals going into the year, and in parallel, obviously, the Ukraine invasion. So these two factors translated into record high energy costs for industrial. You can see it on the left side graph here. And those high energy costs in the end led to, or relatively rapidly led to 3 successive waves of production curtailment on the industry side, mainly for, let's say, gas and power intensive industry. So our team, we did a lot of work on that. I remember, I think it was back in September 22, we had identified around 70 plus installations who had publicly announced production curtailment there. And overall, in terms of analysis, we're looking just from those public announcements at roughly, I think it was around 20 million emission cuts, just from a public side, basically, in terms of announcement. To me, one key element which is very interesting is the two aspect of production curtailment. There is the temporary production curtailment, and there are the more permanent production cuts that we saw happening in the market. If you look on a micro level, for example, and you look at a couple of the industry reports from companies, you can see that high energy costs, really led some of the industry to consider structural changes to their production in order to reduce both gas demand and power demand in the long term, for instance. So if you take the example of, for instance, BASF, you look in the latest or former quarter in Q4 2022, they discuss at length in there how they looked all across the value chain in terms of, I don't know, ammonia, for example, adipic acid, TDI, etc. And they looked at their production cost, competitiveness, and in the end took the decision then to close some of the plants, ammonia plant, for example, and the related fertilizer activities there, and same thing for adipic acid for some of the installation. And in the end, super interesting, if you look at the Ludwigshafen plant, for example, for BASF, you were looking at sort of double-digit decrease, 10 to 15% decrease in terms of gas power demand amid those structural changes having been made. And obviously in the long term, this will have also an impact in terms of reduced emission for industrials. So my point being, it's not just about temporary production curtailment with the potential to come back. There are also permanent production, which one has to consider. The second graph here shows you how high energy cost led to production curtailment, which in the end led to quite large scale emission reduction all across industrials there. It was quite significant. Maybe the only outlier was oil and gas there, but that's for specific reason for that sector in terms of fuel switch there to heavier oil and also increase crude oil throughput there. But that's another topic. If we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. We just looked at 2022. If we look more, let's say forward to 2023. Overall, since August 2022, the energy costs for industrial have decreased significantly. So in principle, it should be very positive for them, for their, let's say, production outlook and business. The challenge is that when one problem goes away, we've seen another one emerge, i.e. a relatively bearish macro outlook for 2023. On the ground, what it means is that it translated since the beginning of the year into relatively weak demand for industrials. Let's have a look at it a little bit on two sides. The first side, let's have a look at key indicators there, which are usually a good proxy for industrial demand. The first one is EU27 gas demand, and the second one being EU27 power demand. So when you consider the growth in March, April, and May of 2023, and you compare to year on year to last year at the same period, you can see that despite the fact that energy costs, i.e. gas and power, for example, have come down, we are still looking at very suboptimal, unimpressive industrial demands from the European industry, although the conditions should have in principle improved quite significantly. That's the first point. The second point is if you look maybe more on the, let's say on the micro level, that's the word I used a little bit earlier, and you look at the industrial report, super interesting to see the common trend that we can see in those reports, i.e. that most of the sectors are reporting significantly lower volumes than normal. In simple words, they're basically saying, hey guys, we're starting the year in Q1 2023, and we're actually seeing quite significantly lower demand from our key customers, the infrastructure, the construction, etc. And it's very interesting to see that some of those industrials have maybe relatively solid results or even good results, but they might have had actually, or let's say, the reason why they had relatively solid result was, for example, pricing for their products. However, the volume, the weak demand translated in lower volume, which in the end affected negatively their results. And if you look also towards their view towards 2023, it's also a relatively common trend among them. They're seeing H1 as relatively suboptimal in terms of performance, in terms of weak demand. H2 getting slowly better, and then moving into 2024, a lot of them are hoping for a potential recovery there in 2024. And a lot of them are hoping for better results coming from China. Obviously, a lot had bets in terms of recovery from China after COVID. It did not really materialize as planned. So many are hoping, obviously, that it will improve the demand side. One last point I want to mention, which I think is very important on this slide, is previous slide I talked about permanent shutdown, gave the example, for example, of a couple of plants from BASF. Keep in mind there are obviously the second aspect of it, which is temporary shutdown. And the key question is, when are we going to see them ramping up production? What will be the magnitude? And that's really a key uncertainty. Once again, the appearances can be a bit deceiving. Yes, we have seen falling energy costs, but if you look at sectors like aluminium sector, for example, very much facing headwinds and challenges there, because once again, as I mentioned, weak demand, they have pressurized quite significantly the price of aluminium, and in that context, also their margins. And in tandem with that, you still have the risk of potential rising energy costs as we're going to winter. Yes, very comfortable EU storage going into the winter, around 75%, but still, a lot of them are mentioning that potential risks. If you look by end of 2022, you had roughly 1.4, 1.5 million tons of aluminum smelter capacity, which stood idle. And recently, if you look at the industry report from Hydro and their webcast, they're talking about the CEO about 500,000 tons in terms of aluminium capacity being at risk should we see increased energy prices once again in the winter. So my point here on that slide is improving condition on the energy cost side, but still definitely some headwinds when we're thinking about macro, and definitely not out of the woods in terms of production curtailment there. Next slide, please. I don't know if it's my computer not functioning, but I cannot see the next slide. Ingo, is that the next slide on 2030? Yes. Okay, brilliant. Now I can see it. Thank you very much. 2030, new balancing rule for the industry. What I mean by that title is simply the EU ETS landscape is changing at a very rapid pace. Historically, we always saw the power sector take the role of balancing the market. It just meant that simply when the market was short, for example, we saw always the power sector being the key agent, which would bring fuel switch from coal to gas potential to the market and being able to balance, for instance, a short market. Well, with the coal phase out that we are currently experiencing and which will increase in speed as time goes by, the burden of balancing the market will move away from the power sector towards the industry, which means as we're losing that fuel switch from coal to gas potential, it is the industry who will have to deliver not short-term fuel switch potential, but long-term permanent abatements. And that will be really, I would say, the critical thing which will have to happen during this phase in order, in the long term, for the market also to function properly in the end. Left side is just a brief map showing a little bit of the key projects in Europe up to 2030 in terms of decarbonizations there. Right side is the more interesting part. Here I was trying to highlight the delta between what is planned in terms of decarbonization, in terms of abatement by key industrials. Here, think about all the key projects on the green steel side, for example, on the CCS side, etc., and what is actually required according to our model. So you can see there's a huge gap between what has been announced so far to be delivered by 2030 and what is actually required in order to reach the target. First point here, which I think is quite interesting, is to have a look at the sectoral discrepancy in the plan abatement. Metal sector is overrepresented compared to other sector. It's very interesting in the sense that you've got a lot of the assets on the metal sector side in Europe, which are reaching the end of their lifetime there. So there's definitely a new investment opportunity for that sector, perhaps compared to other sectors. And the second key point is that the metal sector has access to a bit of a bridge technology towards green steel, for example. So if you take the left side of the map, for example, left bottom, you know, that large green round there, it represents the ArcelorMittal project, the green steel one in Spain. Super expensive project in the run of the 1 billion project. The idea is for green steel, but it's a step-by-step project. First, by 2025, they will basically deliver a project moving away from traditional blast furnace technology, BF-BOF, towards moving towards direct reduction iron combined with electric arc furnace. So it's really interesting how they can first do that by 2025, deliver, I think it's around 5 million tons per annum of reduction, and then move towards full green steel hydrogen there. So instead of using gas in the DRI process, you can use hydrogen in the future by 2030 powered by solar. But the whole point compared to other sectors is that first, you do that step by step, and then once the infrastructure is there for hydrogen, then you can move towards the full decarbonization. But if you think of other sectors, such as the cement sector, for instance, those guys don't have that opportunity to do a step-by-step sort of technology decarbonization. They are forced in the end to rely very much on CCS for large-scale decarbonization. That's definitely a challenge when the infrastructure, at least so far, is not there. So when we're thinking finally about the key pillars, think about hydrogen in the context, obviously, of green steel, chemical sector, obviously, and then think about CCS for all the industrial processes which have unavoidable emissions. And finally, last but definitely not least, one has to think about all the extra renewables which will have to be brought on board, not only to obviously green, obviously the power sector, but definitely for the decarbonization of the industrial sector, as we've discussed, for example, for the metal sector. Last slide, and I will stop, Ingo. Just the key takeaways. 2023, as I said, energy costs are down, but definitely some risk on both the margin and the volume side, as we discussed. Midterm, there's definitely uncertainty surrounding the ramp up of production curtailment. We discussed, for example, earlier, the aluminium sector. And finally, the long term, as I said, very large gap between what has been planned so far in the pipeline and what is being required. So I'll be quiet now, I give you back the floor then Ingo.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for this great overview. And with that, we will move on to the Q&A, and I will ask that we get Ingvild, Jos, and Jan back on the screen for our discussion. Jos has a hard stop at 4 o'clock. So looking through the questions that we received, I will ask the first question to Jos. Yeah. And then there's, of course, many questions about what happened in the markets the last couple of days. What's your price forecast? I assume Jos will not want to comment on his price forecasts. So from that perspective, let me start with the first question to Jos from the audience. We had a discussion and Ingvild's presentation that the EU ETS cap will reach 0 in 2039, 2040. And the question was, how will the supply of EUAs work post 2040 when, of course, the cap is at 0, and assuming as well that the market stability reserve is empty?
Well, yes, if I can give it a go. Now, the forecast that there is no issuance in 2039 is for ETS 1. So that is the power sector and the manufacturing sector and internal aviation as it is known today. We have, of course, an ETS2 coming online. We don't know exactly, the convergence between the two systems, but that is an unknown. But even under the ETS1, we can assume that a lot of financial and industrial operators have a savings account of allowances. And then the question is to what extent that savings account is going to be brought to the market. That's the question about liquidity. If they all would be hoarding their savings EUAs, then there may be a lack of liquidity into the market. And that brings me to the suggestion that I think we should revisit. That is that we may need a carbon bank, because all the elements that were here raised, the ETS2, the removals, the offsets, the liquidity as such, financial stability, the very complicated scheme that Ingvild was coming up, with the repower, front loading, backloading, etc. So all these elements may need a more proactive supervisor in case there would be an illiquid market, because let's face it, in 2040, not all industrial sectors will have reduced their emissions up to zero. There is always going to be a leftover also in the steel market, even if they go for hydrogen and whatever, some 5-10% of the emissions will remain. So I would say, we are entering, as I feel it, in another phase of the ETS once this phase 4 has started. The system will need substantive reviews, and they are in the making. The ETS2, the removers, the whatever, they're linked with the repower. But, we will have to have a rethink on that. We can not simply continue without any change. And there was also a question in the chat box on whether guarantees of origin are allowed for biogas under the ETS. No, the currency under the ETS is the EUA. So guarantees of origin are not traded under the ETS. So that's perhaps a legalistic answer, but it's an important answer. So who has the obligations under the ETS? It is the installations. It is even not the companies. It is installation-based. There is a recording made, an MRV process, what the emissions are per installation. And I do not know now by heart what the emission factor is for biogas. So apologies for that. But, the guarantees of origin as such cannot be traded. Only EUAs are traded, and EUAs are necessary to the extent the emissions are coming from out of an installation. And if biogas can be used to reduce those emissions, I think they are going to be indirectly factored in. So that would be my reply to that question. Over to you, Ingo.
Fantastic. And thank you very much for joining us today. On the markets, and there's, of course, many questions around that. I mean, if you look at EUA prices the last couple of days, I mean, we were trading below 80, and now we're trading around 95. And first question to you, Jan. I mean, what's your view on the recent market moves, and from your perspective, what drove prices during the last couple of days?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Ingo. Overall, we've seen quite indeed a very bullish movement on the carbon side. When you look at the data, though, it's rather clear that the move was, let's say, driven by positioning here in the market. I would look at the two commodities, at gas and carbon. We saw a lot of sort of amid this, bearish fundamentals on the gas side. We saw a lot of, let's say, short positioning first on gas, and also a lot of short positioning definitely on the carbon side in the past few weeks and months there. On the carbon side, I think we reached a record in terms of net short. We were looking at roughly minus 25 million on the investment funds side, But obviously, there's been a little bit of a textbook short squeeze, which happened first on gas and then sort of spilled over into carbon. We saw, again, textbooks short squeeze, rising carbon prices, but in parallel, declining open interest. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that positioning was the main driver there. And in that context, in terms of outlook, what I would expect is simply that once sort of this short-term trend is, final in terms of closing down those positions, then I would expect the price to retrace to their original fundamental position, which is more of a fair value compared to what it is right now, which would be more towards the 80 euro level rather than the above 90 where we are right now.
Yeah, fantastic for that. Ingvild, how do you see that, and where is your, let's call it, end of 23 forecast?
Yeah, no, yeah, good. No, I think first I agree with Jan, but also I think it's the gas market, the movements there is also showing. I mean, it has come much from the supply side. For instance, like extended outages in Norway now. So it seems like it's very kind of, the gas market is still quite jumpy. I mean, we were deep into fuel switching range for the front of the gas curve. So I think kind of, I mean, we're still kind of nervous about what's going to happen when we're entering winter. How full will the storage be? I mean, we're quite kind of optimistic. Everyone is quite optimistic that we will have quite full storage when we're entering winter. But then I think this now just shows that it's quite kind of this nervousness around the gas market, because I mean, if we lose the Norwegian gas, or if less LNG is coming to the market, then where should the gas come from as well? But as Jan pointed out, we're quite, I mean, it's quite a lot of bearishness, like fundamentally wise in the carbon market. We're looking at a year with low emissions. More supply is coming second half of H2, but then towards the end of the year, we're getting into, I mean, just looking at the fuel switching curve, we're then don't see kind of too much fuel switching in the winter season, because you don't have that gas to cater for additional power demand. So then we're getting a bit more kind of coal back in the mix. But I think first and foremost, what's driving kind of towards the end of the year will be the anticipation of the like first two of rebasing, a steeper linear reduction factor. So we have a bit kind of more bullish view towards the end of the year. So our price forecast for Q4 is average price of 94 euros. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So more or less that level that we're currently trading. One factor that was always discussed, Ingvild, was about the auctioning of the additional allowances for the innovation fund, and that seems to be delayed. Do you have a view on that when we get more clarity, or? Yeah.
I was hoping that we would have clarity months ago, but I mean, now we know that no innovation fund volume will hit the market this year. So it's only like member states, like some of the front-loaded member states auctions that will come to the market this year. Kind of, they say that it's because they need to do like an update of the auction regulation, but still it's that's kind of coming towards the end of, and I mean probably like in the autumn, where we'll see some details on that. And I think the interesting thing is that in the Repower EU, it specifically says that the member states auction volumes will be front-loaded. It doesn't mention like front loading from the innovation fund. So of course now every year it's kind of 40 million tons is auctioned to the innovation fund. So the question now, if this pot that is coming from the innovation fund, will that be fully front loading of what's supposed to be auctioned in later years, or will it be a hybrid version that you will take some of these that are already auctioned per year for innovation fund? You just reduce kind of the amount that goes to the innovation fund. So I think it's like the range that we could see of volumes hitting the market next year and the year to come is going to be. I think that's kind of quite interesting to see how that will what we will get from the Commission there. I think that's the biggest uncertainty for me, how if it will be a hybrid version or if it will be this full front loading of the innovation fund, because that matters quite a lot when it comes to the volumes that will hit the market.
Yeah, no, it will be interesting, and let's see, in case prices would tick up, and maybe that speeds up that kind of process in the coming weeks and months. Of course, we have the short-term price forecasts. Many people are asking then, what's your, let's call it midterm and your longer-term price forecast, and possibly as well, beside pure numbers, what are the main drivers that are important to watch? Let's start with Jan on that side. If you look into midterm, and let's call that 2025, so mid phase 4, what do you expect here on the price front, and what are the key things that you and your colleagues on the analytics side are watching? You might be on mute.
He's out.
Or he's out. Well, then, Ingvild, you have to answer that.
Yeah, I tried to kind of sum it up with the color coding. So, of course, kind of mid-phase, I think we are, I mean, it's, even though it's uncertainty on the supply side, it's more certain probably than the demand side. But, of course, now we see a few years where we kind of are cushioning the effect of the repower, or kind of with the Fit for 55 with the repower volumes. Of course, that is it's kind of shifting a bit kind of the volumes. So of course, mid-phase, we are getting into quite kind of with the speed up of the linear reduction factor, with this front loading of already tight future, that will be all focus on that. And of course now, I mean, we have had some special years with, for instance, the COVID, where market stability reserve was really kind of acting also as a safety net. I mean, and we saw that from the price reaction. But when we're getting into like mid-2020s and beyond, the market stability reserve is dormant. So these instances will be felt much harder. Even, I mean, for instance, let's say that we had like a year last year where we had to kind of ramp up power or ramp up more of the coal stack. That will be kind of felt more directly, I guess, on the carbon price, because of course, if you increase emissions or delay phase out of some power plants, that will just like directly eat into what you can emit in the future. So that's going to be quite interesting to see. Typically these COVID events or the energy crisis events that we now have had market stability reserve to cushion a bit. So yeah, very interesting times ahead. And also with Jan showed like permanent destruction in or temporary or permanent destruction in the industry, how much of these will kind of ramp up again, and how soon will the abatement that is needed happen in the industrial sector.
Fantastic. And well, Ingvild, thank you very much for staying with me during that time. And thanks for staying, and sorry for overrunning the discussion a little bit. As mentioned, in case you have any other additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your BBVA representative. And we will, of course, come back to you with answers to the questions that you would have. In this context, thanks again, Ingvild, thanks Jos, and thanks Jan for joining us for today's discussion. Thanks as well for Fatima, for Mathieu, Giovanni, and Mar for the support, setting everything up. And with that, yeah, thank you very much and have a good day.